Before time held a name, there was only the void. It was not merely empty, it was a heavy, absolute silence that pressed against the edges of nothingness. No pulse, no breath, no shadow to define the dark. It existed in a state of perfect, frozen stillness. Then, the silence broke. A single command cut through the nothingness, vibrating with the force of a hammer strike against glass. Let there be light. The sound did not travel through air. It resonated through the very fabric of the void itself. In that heartbeat, the darkness did not simply fade. It shattered. A blinding, white brilliance erupted from a singular point. It tore through the emptiness, turning the absolute black into a canvas of searing radiance. The light surged outward, claiming the infinite expanse as its own, and the history of everything began. The brilliance did not dissipate. Instead, it slowed, cooling into a swirling golden mist that stretched across the infinite reach. Then, the motion began. A rhythmic, gravitational pulse gripped the light, drawing it inward and spinning it outward in vast, spiraling arms. Galaxies took shape, massive wheels of dust and flame turning in the dark, carving paths through the emptiness. The sheer scale of the movement was relentless, a silent, grinding dance of creation that spanned light years in a heartbeat. Deep within these spinning clouds, the pressure mounted. Heat intensified, crushing the elements together until the first spark caught. A star ignited, then another, then a billion more, each one flaring to life like an ember caught in a hearth. They burned with a steady, piercing intensity, puncturing the velvet black with points of searing white and deep, burning crimson. The chaos of the beginning had been tamed into a clockwork of light, a vast, glowing architecture that stretched from horizon to horizon. The focus narrowed. From the vast, spinning tapestry of stars, the attention pulled toward a single, swirling sphere of water and rock. It hung in the silence, a chaotic, unformed mass. Then, the command resonated again. The crust shuddered. Deep beneath the surface, tectonic plates groaned and ground against one another, forced upward by an invisible hand. Land tore through the surface of the global ocean, rising in jagged, steaming peaks that pierced the clouds. Where the earth rose, the water retreated, forced into deep, carved basins that formed the first seas. The surface was raw, scarred, and barren, but the transformation did not pause. A new pulse moved through the soil. Beneath the surface, roots pushed downward, anchoring the shifting earth. Above, the silence was broken by the sound of growth. Green shoots pierced the crust, unfurling with a speed that defied the seasons. Forests erupted from the rock. The world was ready, but it lacked a pulse. The sky hung in a flat, unchanging gray, waiting for the final calibration of the heavens. Then, the command echoed through the firmament. A massive, searing orb tore through the clouds, taking its place at the zenith of the sky. The light was absolute. It struck the forests, turning the dew on every leaf into a diamond, and casting long, sharp shadows against the mountain faces. The heat began to rise, baking the stone and stirring the atmosphere into a steady, warm breeze. But the light was relentless, a constant, blinding glare. As the sun reached the edge of the horizon, it dipped, and the sky deepened into a velvet, bruised purple. From the opposite side of the dome, a pale silver disk ascended. It did not burn. It glowed with a cool, reflected intensity. The transition was seamless. The frantic, growing energy of the day slowed into the quiet, watchful stillness of the night. The sun and moon locked into their eternal, opposing paths, creating a rhythmic, predictable cycle. Order had arrived. The planet began to breathe. The world was perfect, yet it remained a stage without an audience. The forests swayed and the tides pulled, but there was no witness to the rhythm. Then, the scale of the narrative shifted. The focus tightened, pulling away from the heavens to a quiet, sun-drenched clearing. A shadow fell across the soil. God knelt in the dust, the movement deliberate and heavy. He reached down, gathering the damp earth, pressing the grit between his fingers. He worked the clay, folding, shaping, and refining the form, until a body lay still upon the ground. It was a vessel of bone and muscle, perfectly aligned, yet cold and motionless. The air in the clearing grew heavy, charged with a sudden, localized pressure. God leaned close. He pressed his own breath into the lungs of the form. The chest cavity expanded, a sharp, sudden intake of air that rattled through the ribcage. The body stiffened, then relaxed. Fingers twitched, digging into the soft, dark soil. Slowly, the eyelids fluttered. Adam opened his eyes. The world did not appear as a blur. It hit him in a rush of saturation. He was no longer part of the dust. He was the life that moved within it. Adam stood in the center of the clearing, his feet pressing into the moss. He watched the birds carve paths through the clouds, and the fish dart through the crystal water. But he remained the only one of his kind. The garden was vast, filled with the scent of crushed mint and damp earth. Yet the silence of his solitude grew heavy. God observed him from the shade of the boughs. The air in the garden grew still, the wind dying down until the leaves hung motionless. Adam felt a sudden, deep lethargy pull at his limbs. He sank to the soft grass, his eyes closing as the world around him faded into a rhythmic, pulsing hum. He did not wake until the light had shifted to a golden, late afternoon glow. When he opened his eyes, he was not alone. Beside him stood Eve. She moved with the same fluid grace, her gaze tracing the patterns of the sunlight on the bark. They stood together, the weight of the garden now shared between them. They began to walk, their footsteps silent on the forest floor. In the stillness, they walked. The garden continued to pulse with life, but the rhythm began to stutter. Adam and Eve moved toward the center, where the light seemed to thicken and pool around the roots of the great tree. The air grew dense, losing its clarity, and the distant calls of birds ceased abruptly. A low, dry sound scraped against the bark of the central trunk. It was the sound of something heavy dragging itself across wood. A serpent emerged from the dense foliage, its body coiling around the lower branches. It did not strike. It waited. Its scales caught the fading light, shifting from dull bronze to a sharp, metallic sheen. It moved with a slow, deliberate precision, weaving through the leaves until it reached the deepest patch of shade. Adam and Eve stopped, their attention pulled toward the movement in the dark. The serpent lowered its head, its eyes fixed on the fruit hanging inches from its reach. It did not move again. It remained perfectly still, a silent anchor in the center of the garden. Then, the silence broke. A voice, low and resonant, cut through the stillness. The air around the tree grew heavy, thick with a pressure that pushed against their skin. Eve stepped forward, her fingers brushing the smooth, cool surface of the fruit. She did not hesitate. She gripped the stem, twisted, and pulled. The branch snapped with a sharp, dry crack that echoed through the clearing. She held the fruit, its skin vibrant and pulsing, and took a bite. The juice stained her fingers, dark and rich. She turned to Adam, her hand steady as she offered it to him. He reached out, his palm meeting hers, and he took his own bite. The reaction was instantaneous. The sun, which had hung in a permanent golden zenith, shuddered. The light began to bleed out of the sky, the brilliant blue draining into a flat, suffocating gray. The vibrant greens of the forest dulled, turning the color of ash. The wind died completely. The trees seemed to shrink, their leaves curling and dropping to the ground. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden biting chill that crept up from the soil. Adam and Eve stood motionless, the fruit still in their hands, watching as the horizon lost its luster. The perfection was gone. The fruit fell from their hands, thudding against the dirt. Adam looked down at his palms, then at his own skin, and the air seemed to turn sharp against him. He pulled his arms across his chest, a sudden, jagged movement of self-protection. Eve mirrored the motion, her eyes darting toward the dense, tangled brush at the edge of the clearing. They were no longer part of the garden. They were intruders within it. They reached for broad, waxy leaves, tearing them from the stalks with frantic, shaking fingers to hide their bodies. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against their ears. They scrambled backward, feet slipping on the damp soil, and crawled into the deepest, darkest shadows beneath the ferns. Their breathing came in short, sharp gasps that sounded too loud in the stillness. They pressed their backs against the rough, cold bark of a tree, pulling their knees to their chests. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, made them flinch. The voice that had once been the rhythm of their days now carried a different weight. They heard the sound of footsteps on the path, deliberate and slow, approaching the clearing. They did not move. They did not speak. They huddled deeper into the dark, their eyes fixed on the light, waiting for the sound that would shatter their hiding place. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, a voice cut through the air, resonant and steady. "Where are you?" Adam and Eve flinched, their bodies pressing tighter against the bark. They did not answer. The voice spoke again, closer now, and they emerged from the shadows, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the ground. They stood before the source of the light, unable to look up. The judgment fell, not as a shout, but as a final, irreversible shift in the world. The garden began to change. The lush, soft grasses under their feet hardened into dry, jagged stalks. The fruit-laden boughs above them withered. A cold, biting wind swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of dust and decay. They were turned away from the path. As they stepped beyond the boundary, the earth beneath them shifted, rising in sharp, pointed ridges. Thorns sprouted from the soil. They stood on the edge of a vast, silent wilderness. The first humans to know the weight of toil and the bite of the cold. The first generation broke the soil with sharpened sticks, but the earth yielded only dust and dry, gray stalks. Sweat carved lines into their faces as they fought for every handful of grain. Then, the struggle shifted. The tools meant for the harvest were turned against one another. A brother raised a stone against his kin, and the red stain on the dirt marked the arrival of a new, cold reality. Generations bled into one another. The quiet of the garden was replaced by the sharp, metallic ring of iron striking iron. Villages rose, but they were built behind high, jagged walls. Men stood on watchtowers, scanning the horizon not for the sun, but for the approach of raiders. The air grew thick with the smoke of burning fields. Trust dissolved. Neighbors hid their stores of food in deep buried pits, watching the shadows for any sign of theft. Humanity had forgotten the sound of a voice that spoke in peace, drowning it out with the relentless grinding noise of survival. The clamor of the world reached a fever pitch, then abruptly cut to nothing. In the stillness, a single voice resonated, distinct and heavy with intent. Noah stood alone in a field of dry, cracked earth. He looked up, his eyes narrowing against the harsh glare of a sun that seemed to be fading. "Build an ark," the command echoed. He did not hesitate. He walked to the edge of the forest, his hand resting on the rough bark of a towering cedar. He took his axe and swung. The first strike rang out, a sharp, metallic crack that traveled across the barren valley. He began to clear the timber, his muscles straining as he dragged the heavy trunks to the center of the clearing. Day after day, the rhythm remained the same. The bite of the blade, the groan of falling wood, and the steady, rhythmic thud of the hammer. Above him, the sky began to bruise, turning a deep, sickly shade of violet. Clouds gathered, swirling in tight, dense knots that blocked the light. Noah hammered on, driving iron spikes into the massive beams. Each strike sounded like a heartbeat in the void, a steady, relentless pulse. The structure rose as the first heavy drops fell. The first drops were heavy, striking the dry earth like stones. Within minutes, the sky opened. It was not a storm, but a collapse of the heavens. The rain fell with such density that the horizon vanished, replaced by a wall of gray, churning water. The ground, long hardened by drought, could not drink. It pooled, then surged, turning the valley into a violent, rushing river. Trees that had stood for centuries groaned as the soil beneath them liquefied and gave way. They toppled, their roots clawing at the air before being dragged into the dark, swirling currents. The water rose, inch by agonizing inch, claiming the lowlands first. It swallowed the fields, the stone walls, and the remnants of the old world. Noah's structure groaned, its timbers straining against the mounting pressure as it lifted from the earth. The rain did not slacken. Mountains, once the pillars of the earth, began to disappear. The peaks were shrouded in mist, then overtaken by the relentless rising tide. The roar of the rain died as quickly as it had begun. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the surface of the endless gray expanse. For days, there was only the slow, rhythmic lap of water against the sides of the floating structure. Then, the surface began to shift. The water level dropped, inch by agonizing inch, exposing the jagged, slick spine of a mountain peak. It rose from the depths like a dark, dripping monolith. Noah pushed open the heavy hatch. The air was thin, cold, and tasted of salt and wet stone. He stepped onto the sodden, mud-caked ground. Below, the receding tide revealed a landscape stripped of everything. There were no trees, no paths, no signs of the old world. Everything was clean, raw, and still. Noah stood at the edge of the slope, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. He looked up. The thick, bruised clouds began to tear apart, revealing a sliver of brilliant, piercing blue. A single ray of light struck the mist, refracting into a sharp, vibrant arc of color. It stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, a bridge of light against the fading gloom. The colors burned bright: violet, indigo, green, and gold. Generations drifted like dust in the wind, and the world settled into a quiet, forgotten rhythm. Then, the silence broke. It was not a thunderclap, but a steady, resonant command that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of the earth. Abraham stood in the center of his courtyard, his hand resting on the rough timber of his gate. The voice did not ask, it directed. "Leave your home. Go to a land I will show you." He looked back at the hearth, the stacked grain, and the stone walls that had anchored his life for decades. He did not hesitate. He began to clear his space, folding his heavy mats and securing his supplies. Every movement was deliberate. He extinguished the fire in the pit, leaving the ashes to cool in the morning air. He latched the gate behind him, the sound of the wood clicking shut, final and sharp. He stepped onto the dusty track that led away from everything he knew. There were no maps, no familiar landmarks, and no destination in sight. He walked with a steady, rhythmic stride, his shadow stretching long across the barren ground. He did not look back at the life he had abandoned. The horizon did not change for years. The dust of the road coated Abraham's skin, and the sun bleached the color from his supplies. Then, the rains failed. The ground cracked into deep, jagged fissures that swallowed the moisture of the night. His grain stores sat empty, the wood hollow and dry. He stood in the center of a barren field, his hand pressing against the parched stalks. Every instinct urged him to turn back to the fertile lands he had left. He looked at the path behind him, then at the vast, shimmering heat haze ahead. He did not turn. He tightened his grip on his staff and moved forward, his boots kicking up clouds of fine, suffocating silt. The years carved deep lines into his face, and his joints stiffened under the weight of the long, relentless trek. He slept on the hard earth, his body aching. He was a man defined by the distance he had traveled and the silence he had endured. He carried no map, only the resonance of a promise. He moved with the steady, heavy rhythm of a man who knew that the destination was not a place, but a purpose unfolding in the dust. The dust that settled on the road behind Abraham is the same dust that formed the first man. This is not a closed chapter in a dusty book. It is a current, living reality. Look at your own hands. The same force that carved the basins of the seas and ignited the first stars is still in motion. It is not a distant memory. It is a present weight. The hand that gathered the earth to breathe life into lungs is still reaching into the void today. It is moving through the silence of your own struggles, shaping the landscape of your path even when the ground feels unstable. You are not a spectator to a finished history. You are part of the ongoing work. The same energy that turned darkness into light is currently at work in the quiet corners of your life. It is the steady, unseen pressure that keeps the galaxies spinning and the heart beating. Every breath you take is a continuation of that first, ancient command. The blueprint of the rescue did not stop with the ancients. It is unfolding in the here and now. The hand that held the stars is holding your story. It is still sculpting, still carving, and still reaching into the emptiness to bring forth something new. The void is not empty. It is waiting for the next movement of that same, persistent hand. If your world feels fractured, or your path seems to dissolve into shadow, stop and listen. The silence you face is not an absence. It is the space where the next command is spoken. You are standing in the middle of a story that refuses to end in ruin. Look at the ground beneath your feet. It is not just dirt. It is the material of a design that is still being assembled. When you feel the weight of your own struggle, you are not being forgotten. You are being held. The same voice that called light into the void is currently speaking into your personal darkness. It is not calling you to look back at what was broken, but to look forward at what is being restored. The hand that carved the seas is reaching into your life right now, pulling order from the chaos. You are not here by accident. You are here for a reason that predates the first sunrise. The story did not end in the garden, and it does not end with your current struggle. It is a living, breathing work that continues with every choice you make. Look forward. The void is not a dead end. It is the space where your next chapter begins. The Creator is still writing, still restoring, and still speaking into the silence of your life. Every heartbeat is a word in a sentence that has been unfolding since time began. You are the protagonist of a narrative that is being crafted with purpose. The ink is still wet, the page is still turning. Your story is not finished, and the hand that formed the stars is still holding the pen. Step into the light of what is coming next. The story is yours, and it is still being told.